Okay, so what are we going to... Okay, so what I'm going to do is, when we broke it down, the thing that we wanted to remember is that we were looking at glancing angles, okay? And we've gone over this before, but I'm just going to go ahead and do this again. We're going to create a facing ratio shader network here, okay? So this is where we create a ramp here, right? And we'll make a couple of quick mental notes here. By default, this comes in as a V ramp, right? So this ramps along the V direction of our UV maps, and then the place 2D here is what makes it map on that V direction, right? But honestly, we don't really care about that for this, right? We're going to delete that. We don't need it. We're going to feed it a brand new number here to give positional data on the ramp for the rendering position in the screen space here. So we want to scroll down here to utilities, and close to the bottom, but not quite the bottom, scroll back up. There is sampler info. This is a node that looks at a whole bunch of things in each sample of the camera, right? Which is everything here in this view, the render view. It's going to look at this and say, which way is this surface facing, and which way is it facing in relation to the camera, in relation to the world, all these things, right? So what we're going to do is we're going to map the V direction, the V ramp, to the facing ratio, which is provided here. Here it is. And so what happens is we're going to feed it how much of this surface is facing the camera, right? So drag and drop and let it go. And we're going to say other. Whoops, I can't see that down here. I want to make sure that you can see this one. Right, we're going to drag, drop, and say other. Okay, that brings up our connection editor where we can say I want to take my facing ratio, one click, and I got to see my UV coordinates are grayed out, but if I open this, you can see that it says U and V, so to the V coordinate, right? And something should happen over here, something magical, which is that this turns into a solid color, which is completely unhelpful, but as long as you can see that this is the connection that's made, that's good news, right? We can see it by mousing over it here too, facing ratio into the V chord. Now we're going to drag this, and we'll middle mouse drag it, drop it right onto incandescence. Okay, so funkiness happens here. So what does that mean for us, right? Let's render again. Bum, bum, bum. Okay, so right off the bat, we can see what's happening, right? We can see that the parts of the surface that are not facing the camera are turning red, whereas the parts of the surface that are much more directly looking at the camera, those are blue, okay? And very nicely for us that it's actually obeying the bump map as well. All right, so let me stop this and take a closer look. Okay, so you can see that here, as this fold falls away from the camera, we get right into that red. And here we can see the green and the blue. And here, these parts that are facing the camera, they're much more blue. So this is useful to us, right? Because when we looked at our reference, right, it's these parts here that sort of fall away from the camera that pick up a little bit of extra light here. You know, as this pillow curves away, we're catching a little bit more light than we do on other parts of the surface. So this is useful, but obviously in its current form, it is not. Okay, so again, looking at this, you might say, oh, well, what if we just shift it to white? All right, because when I look at this, it looks like we're getting a little bit more white in here. We're getting a little more white in here, right? And the incandescence really just adds values to our current render. So if I take and I can see my results here, I deleted my green. I take my blue, I'm going to slide that down to black. That's right in the middle. Now I can see that my red here is coming out as the bright edge. Okay, so I can drop this all the way down to black and then bring it right back up. It becomes white. Okay, so now look at that. That's looking a little bit more interesting. Now if we render this, okay, we can see once again, okay, now this looks like it's starting to make a little bit more sense. Okay, intense, yes, it is very intense, but it is making sense. Now we could, if we wanted to, once again, go ahead and just make this adjustment in here. And I think, you know, through experimentation, I found that a value somewhere in the 0.35, 0.25 zone produced a result that wasn't so shabby, right? So let's take a look at that. All right, we'll render this out. All right, see now, you can see that as these edges fall away, that we get a brightening. And it is a brightening. And we have to be very careful with this number, right? Because we can make it over bright. It can be really bad really quickly, right? So you have to be very, very gentle with this technique. But, I mean, if we just compare it to where we were, right? We are getting like a softness that's coming in. It's kind of filling in a softness. Again, maybe it's a little too heavy here, but, you know, it's certainly a big step up from where we began, right? So we are getting a nice soft look to it. Okay, so what's the next step to this? Well, the next step is pretty basic, right? When we do look at this, right, we can come in and we can say, okay, well, we knew from our original simple ramp shader that it does sort of obey the surface normals, right, which is nice because it's obeying the bump map, right? But if we want a little bit better of a result, okay, one thing we may want to consider doing is taking our bump map, which does have a nice look to it. You know, here we can see that our bump map is really, well, not here. Let's take a look at it here. Our bump map is really based on the idea that these threads are higher up than the parts where the weave is going below, right? So it would stand to reason that these lighter areas would be the ones creating this reaction. Okay, so let's take a look at what we can do to make that happen. Okay, well, I mean, the easiest way to do this would be to simply replace whatever this color is with this texture, right? And we know that this is easy because we can just middle mouse drag and drop it right onto selected color. Okay, as long as we've got that selected. Now, even in our shader here, you can see that the result is a little bit different. If I can undo that, see if it undoes properly. Right, you can see that I have to redo, edit, redo, and why? Whoops, that's not what I wanted to do. Of course, this happens here. Hypershade. Selected color. All right, so now this brightens up. Now part of the reason is because we had adjusted this all the way down to 0.25, and here we're going right back up into the whites. But let's take a render and see what happens, right? Here's where we are, and now that we render. Okay, much brighter, obviously, but now look, we can see this dappling of detail coming back into how this looks, right? Which is much nicer, right? It gives us a much better textural feel to how this cloth should be reacting, right? So I'll let this render out because we'll store it. Okay, looks nice. One thing I do want to do right away is I want to make it dimmer. Okay, now we could say, all right, well, let's create a whole new map for this, right? But this is already working pretty well. And if we look at here, here's an interesting result, right? Here's an interesting thing. Okay, when it goes to the bump map, you'll notice that it's the out alpha that's going to the bump map, okay? And remember, alpha is luminance. Now, one thing to remember about this little checkbox here is this refers back to the original image coming in. No matter what you do to it here, this refers to the original image. Now we can adjust it here in the color balance, but my real point is that if I can bring down my color gain here, and I bring my color gain down to 0.35, I give it a little bit of extra boost, it doesn't affect what's coming out of my out alpha here. Right? So my bump map will be unaffected by this, but I can adjust my color. So now we've reduced the color back to sort of the zone where we were before. So let's take a look at that. So what's nice about that is that we can make adjustments to these files without necessarily affecting. Now, believe me, that doesn't work in every situation. It's very, very dependent on what you're doing with every single file that you're creating and how you're using it. But in this case, because we have just the out alpha of that from the luminance going to our bump map, and we have just the color going out to be included in this map here, we can make those adjustments non-destructively, okay? And so you can obviously see the difference, right? But you can see in these areas where it's not so affected that our bump looks the same. It's just that we've reduced the effect of this brightening on these edges, okay? So and so let me get rid of this one. We don't need that one anymore, okay? So between these two, you can see that this was the solid color and this is the textural color, right? And it's just it's a minor difference, but it is just a nice addition of additional detail, okay? And of course, back to this blah beginning, right? So here we are, nice and soft. All right, so we've done a lot here. And it would be very easy to sort of stop here and say that this is done, all right? Except that it's not done, right? Because of one critical thing. Now, it's working in this lighting setup here, okay? But let's look at what we've got. My outliner is over here. Okay, so we have a 3-light setup. So what I'm going to do is I'm actually going to hide all the lights. Okay, and render again. Okay, so here's the gotcha with this. Okay, we have no lights in the scene, but here we are showing off the whole tablecloth, right? Because now what we're doing is we are just illuminating based on the normals, right? It doesn't care about the lights. So this is a problem, right? So if I turn on just the backlight, I've unhid that. I can slide this out of the way. Okay, we know that the backlight is on, and I render again. The backlight has shadows on. Okay, these areas here of the cloth that are not illuminated by the light are still creating this additional illumination that we've done because we're plugged into the incandescence channel. Okay, so what we want to do is eliminate that.
Shut up and sit down.